Heads up that this is a Halloween episode. I suppose a word of warning. They sometimes get pretty Halloweenish. This is The Memory Palace. I'm Nate DiMeo. They were in demand. Henry Rathbone was the son of the mayor of Albany, and his father's untimely death when Henry was a teenager left him a fortune. His widowed mother went on to marry a senator, himself a widower, with 4 children of his own. The sort of complicated blending of families and fortunes that kept the powerful powerful. And from this union came another. Henry Rathbone was introduced to Clara Harris, his pretty new stepsister. They became friends, and became more as the Civil War came, right to their doorstep with the Potomac River, the border that separated warring nations, just a dozen miles away from Clara's home just across the park from the White House. And they got engaged right before Henry went to join the fight. And when he returned in one piece, the reunited couple looked ahead to a glorious future. They were young, they were rich, they were in love, they were step-siblings, but I swear that wasn't weird then. And they had all the right friends. In fact, when the Lincolns were looking to go to the theater in April of 1865, that wonderful spring when the war was won was merely waiting for the final paperwork to clear, when fireworks lit up the sky, when the relieved and the drunk and the giddy poured out of the bars and sang songs in the streets, the first couple thought of Henry and Clara. They weren't at the top of their list, if truth be told. The first choice was obvious. Lincoln wanted Ulysses S. Grant, the man of the hour. Except Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln never got along. But Mary Todd Lincoln found her neighbor Clara Harris positively charming, and Clara's husband cut a dashing figure in his uniform. They were a delightful couple. And what better way to spend a spring evening than with young people in love? Picture the Lincoln assassination. Whatever comes to mind will do. Something will, I suspect. An etching, perhaps. A painting that you've seen somewhere along the line. Maybe the most pivotal moment in American history, depicted again and again. The box at Ford's Theater, Lincoln, Booth with his mustache, and his pistol emerging from the back, a flash from the barrel, maybe the swirl of smoke, maybe the horrified wife. You likely don't remember that there are 2 other people in the box. I forget they're there, though they are usually there. A young man in a uniform, a young woman in a satin dress. So picture them there now, even if you don't remember. Lincoln is in his chair by the door. Mary is there, and Henry Rathbone, still with his war mutton chops, on a bench in the back. Clara Harris, his wife, beside him in a dress she'd made for the evening, had felt so good in an hour or 2 before, when they'd walked in with the Lincolns, stood beside them as they basked in the glow of their presence, as the orchestra played Hail to the Chief, as the audience cheered and whooped in honor of the savior of the Union. And then in the third act, as one actor cracked a joke on stage and the audience laughed, gunfire cracked. Right there. It all happened so fast. All was chaos as the actor John Wilkes Booth fired a derringer into the back of the head of Mr. Lincoln. And Mrs. Lincoln screamed, and there was a smell of burned gunpowder and burnt hair. And Henry Rathbone sprung up. It all happened so fast, and grabbed for Booth and his gun, but didn't see the knife, and cried out and lost hold of the assassin as his blade tore at Clara's husband, opened him up from his armpit to his elbow, and blood sprayed as Booth pulled away. And Henry grabbed for him, but just caught his clothes as the killer, as the man who just shot the president, just shot him like that right then, leapt over the railing and into the crowd, and Henry yelled, "Stop that man!" But no one stopped that man. Clara Harris sat with the president's wife in the house across the street from the theater. Sat with her friend Mary as the doctors did what they could but couldn't do enough. Clara's new dress soaked through with blood, through the petticoats, wet on her skin. And her face and her hands were streaked with blood, and she thought to wipe it off, thought to clean it, but she needed to stay with Mrs. Lincoln. People told her to stay with Mrs. Lincoln, who was wailing in her grief and alarm, who would gather herself for a moment and then see young Clara and scream anew, "My husband's blood, my dear husband's blood." And in the days and months that followed, Henry and Clara were everywhere, famous for being there that night. Their stories sought out, their images there at the center of it all. But then those images started to fade away. There are no ghosts, and this isn't a ghost story, but that doesn't mean it isn't haunted. The summer of 1865, Hot and strange after Lincoln's murder had snapped spring in two, Clara Harris went to her family's vacation home in upstate New York. She brought the dress that she had worn that night with her. She hadn't cleaned it, and maybe that someone told her not to. It was history. It was a relic from a martyr, from a man transformed into myth before he'd even been laid in the ground. Or it may have been that she simply couldn't bear to do it, to scrub it out, or to burn it. So she hung it in a closet in the guest bedroom of the house in the woods. In the next spring, when she returned to that house upstate, to get away from D.C. and the commemorations of Lincoln, to escape the things she would remember when he was remembered, she was sleeping in that bedroom on the night of the anniversary, the blood-stained dress still hanging behind the closet door, when she awoke to the sound of laughter, low and resonant. Lincoln's laugh, just as she had heard before the gunshot. Lincoln's ghost. She was certain. Though there are no ghosts. But does that matter if she was certain? Her husband, too, was haunted, though Lincoln never appeared to him. He was haunted. Henry Rathbone never got over that night. At first, it seemed normal, because frankly, it would. The president was shot in the back of the head beside you. You had been having one of the great evenings of your life, you and your future wife, in Washington with Lincoln after Lincoln's great victory, and the president was shot in the back of the head beside you. You had been done with the battlefield, you had made it home alive, and suddenly a gunshot. And suddenly a fight. A knife tearing you open and your wife screaming and stuffing her handkerchief into the hole where your bicep was moments before. And the president is bleeding out beside you, and you could have stopped it. And could you have stopped it? Could you have moved more quickly? Grabbed for the gun, had pushed the president aside, had taken the bullet yourself, or had merely stopped that man, had wrestled him down, took vengeance right there, had been stronger, had been braver, had been more heroic, had been a better man, had been... Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris were married in 1867. They had 3 children. Those children's father never got over that night. Clara Harris's husband would mumble to himself, "Could you have stopped it? Could you have moved more quick? Grabbed for the gun, pushed the president aside? Could he have saved him?" Her husband would have these delusions, would be convinced she was planning to leave him, to take his children away. Her Henry was so haunted by this idea, would bring it up so often that eventually she wished she could run away. Told her family that she would, were she not so afraid that the stain of divorce would haunt her. Instead, she tried to find her husband help. They went off to Europe to see doctors who said they could break him of these thoughts. Instead, it all just broke him. They would return to their parents' house in Albany, where the dress, still bloody, still hung in the closet, and where people would say they heard Lincoln too, disembodied laughter from down the hall, a ghost in their house. Clara Harris became sure of it, and sure it was responsible for her unhappiness and her husband's madness. She had the closet bricked over, like Fortunato behind the wall, and then they set sail again across the Atlantic to put distance between them and the ghosts. But Clara's husband was haunted. He was ill, suffering from some psychiatric disorder for which there was no useful name then, no treatment protocol that had been proven effective by some double-blind study. He was delusional and paranoid and depressed, and who's to say what else now? Before dawn on Christmas Eve in 1883, 18 years after Booth shot Lincoln and then stabbed Henry Rathbone, Henry Rathbone came into the room where his wife was sleeping and shot her, and then stabbed himself 6 times. She died, and he lived. And he was taken to an asylum where the torment didn't end, where he was certain that every night a gas was being pumped into his room, certain that they, whomever they were trying to kill him. He lived there for 3 decades, until he died in 1911, having been haunted for almost 50 years. The dress hung in that closet for nearly as long. People in the house said there were ghosts. They heard Lincoln laughing. They saw Clara Harris, silent in a dress stained with Lincoln's blood. It wasn't Lincoln's blood. The way he was shot, the angle, I'll spare you, but it wasn't Lincoln's blood. It was Henry's. But they didn't believe that. And there are no ghosts. But they didn't believe that. Henry and Clara's son believed the